If I was to sum up histrionic personality disorder in one word, it would be annoying. Hi guys, it's Owen here from D20. Before I start this week's video, I just want to remind you that you have the power in your hands to help me produce this content. If you head over to patreon.com/D20, you can pledge to support me for any amount you like, a couple of dollars a month or $100 a month, whatever you prefer. Every little bit counts, and it adds up to help me keep the lights on while I'm producing this content. If you're unwilling or unable to support in that way, there are other ways you can help as well. You can go to YouTube or Facebook or Twitter and you can subscribe, you can like, you can follow, you can reshare. All of that stuff helps. It all contributes to get the message out there and in front of more eyeballs so that we can get more subscribers in the future. All right, let's get on with today's video. Today I'm going to be talking about a serious topic again. So I've been doing a series on the cluster B personality disorders. I've already done narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder. So we're halfway through already. And today I'm going to be doing the third installment, which is histrionic personality disorder. Histrionic personality disorder is kind of a funny one because superficially it kind of sort of sounds like narcissistic personality disorder, although we'll get into the differences about those later. And some clinicians consider it to not actually be any different to borderline. They think that it's just a variant of borderline personality disorder. But at least as far as the DSM-5 and the World Health Organization are concerned at the moment, they still consider it to be a separate diagnosis. So we'll treat it as that for the purposes of this video, at least until things change. And before I start, I just wanted to remind you that I'm not a clinician. I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I'm just a relatively well-informed layperson. So I try to avoid, and I encourage you to also try to avoid imposing a diagnosis on a person, because I lack the professional qualifications to do that myself, and odds are you probably do too. Just because we're arming ourselves with information to keep an eye on the people around us, and we can treat them as if they have that diagnosis, that doesn't mean we can assume that they actually do. They might have, there's a reasonable assumption that they might have something else going on entirely, and they just sort of present as if they have that diagnosis to the untrained eye. And that's fine. I mean, if they're exhibiting these kinds of behaviors that what we're talking about in this video, then we can interact with them as if they are a histrionic personality disorder sufferer without applying that clinical diagnosis, because we don't have the authority to do so. And there's also another note that is particular to histrionic personality disorder that I want to mention here. The causes of narcissistic and borderline personality disorder are largely mysterious. It's not clear where they come from. But that's not really true when it comes to histrionic personality disorder. There's some pretty well supported ideas about how histrionic personality disorder manifests in a person, where it comes from. It doesn't seem to just sort of randomly manifest around the time of adulthood like those other two kind of sort of do. With histrionic personality disorder in particular, it seems that there's a strong correlation between the condition and people who were, let's say, poorly parented as children. Things like parental neglect or abuse. These kinds of things will sometimes result in the person developing histrionic personality disorder upon adulthood. So that's something else we need to bear in mind when we're dealing with histrionics in particular, is that these people are not only victims of their condition, because it's a mental health condition, but they are also probably victims of a trauma in their formative years that which has led to the formation of this condition. This is a symptom of that trauma, probably. So we need to be extra compassionate when we're dealing with people who have histrionic personality disorder, which can be difficult, and I'll get into why. But bearing that in mind, we need to remember that applying a diagnosis, whether professionally or informally, as we're doing here, doesn't constitute a moral judgment. Just because we can recognize the symptoms of this syndrome in a person, and we can identify that person is probably a sufferer of histrionic personality disorder, that shouldn't be considered a moral judgment. It doesn't make them a bad person. What it does is it informs the way that we interact with that person and how we can navigate that relationship with them. They're not bad people inherently. They can't help what they're doing, although there are treatments that they can seek out, and hopefully they will. We must resist the urge to think of them as bad people. All right, let's that's enough disclaimers. Let's get on to the list. So, as with the other cluster B personality disorders, the DSM-5 lists a bunch of criteria, and you have to meet several of them in order to qualify for the diagnosis. In this case, there are 8 different criteria, and you kind of sort of need to meet 5 of them in order to qualify for the histrionic personality disorder diagnosis. So let's go through that list. The first one is uncomfortable in situations in which he or she is not the center of attention. And this one is key. This one is pretty much the most definitive, in my opinion, the most definitive symptom of this condition is that the histrionic person wants to be the center of attention all the time, all eyes on me. And this is what kind of sort of sounds a bit like narcissistic personality disorder, because they also deal in that currency of attention, but they do so in a different way. We'll get to that a little later. But that's very important about the histrionic. All eyes on me all the time. Everyone needs to be paying attention to me. I'm the one that needs to be looked at. So that's the motivation behind the histrionic personality disorder sufferer. Second criterion. Interaction with others is often characterized by inappropriate, sexually seductive, or provocative behavior. It's worth mentioning at this point that, statistically speaking, sufferers of narcissistic personality disorder are overwhelmingly female. And it's whether it's politically correct or not to say so, it's a fact of life that one of the tools in the box that women have when it comes to social interaction and exercising social influence or power is sexuality. And so it's a fairly common thing for the histrionic sufferer to inappropriately loop in that sexuality tool when they're interacting with people as a way, again, of getting that attention, having all eyes on them. So that's being inappropriately flirtatious, bringing sexual topics up in conversation inappropriately, like in a business meeting or something like that, or dressing provocatively, or wearing a low-cut top to the office, or that kind of thing. This is the sort of thing that this criterion is talking about.
Hi, Adele. Is that a tube top you're wearing?
Good eye. Just a little elastic basket to hold my peaches. Would you like some nectar, Hector?
Next criterion, number 3, is displays rapidly shifting and shallow expression of emotions. This is not dissimilar to what we see in the borderline sufferer, where they have these rapid shifts in mood from rage to kindness to happiness to calm, back to rage to sadness. But the histrionic sufferer doesn't, although they display outwardly these rapid shifts in mood, what the sense you'll get from the histrionic sufferer is that these mood swings are not necessarily sincere. They're not deeply felt. They appear superficial or maybe even fake. So they're fake excited one second and fake angry the next second.
Mood swings! Mood swings. Mood swings. Mood swings? Mood swings. Mood swings! Mood swings! Mood swings! Mood swings, mood swings, mood swings!
Criterion number 4 is consistently uses physical appearance to draw attention to self. So this is, again, all eyes on me, and it's one of the strategies that the histrionic will use to make people look at them. So that's presenting in a visually outstanding way, but consistently doing it all the time. So that we already mentioned the sexually provocative dress. So wearing a low-cut top or short skirts or tight-fitting clothing, that's not at all uncommon. But there are other ways that they might do that. Being obsessed with their appearance, overstyling their hair, overdoing their makeup, hitting the gym too hard, perhaps cosmetic surgery, even unnecessary cosmetic surgery, getting multiple breast augmentation surgeries, that kind of thing. If the person displays an unusually obsessive attitude towards managing their appearance, that's a red flag for histrionic personality disorder. And when I talk about overly styled hair, I don't just mean in sort of an ordinary sexy kind of way. It could be in things like brightly colored hairstyles, switching rapidly from one month to the next. You've got bright blue one month, bright red the next month, bright orange the month after that. That's not at all uncommon in the histrionic sufferer, because it's not only the bright hair color that draws attention and draws the eye, but it's also the changing the hair color gets them more attention, because now everyone around them has to say, hey, wasn't your hair green last month? This shade of purple is lovely. This is the kind of attention grabbing thing we're talking about. Something else like having too many tattoos. Having a full sleeve of tattoos, for example, could be a signal of histrionic personality disorder. There's the opposite side of the coin. So there's the obsession with being extra attractive, with being sexually appealing. There's the opposite side of that, which could also apply, which is allowing themselves to become unreasonably overweight, morbidly obese. The idea there being that they're then taking up physical space in a room, more physical space than most other people are. They're taking up more space in your visual field, so you can't help but look at them. This is a thing that might happen with histrionic personality disorder. I need to be clear that not all of these things are necessarily diagnostic of narcissistic personality disorder. It's perfectly reasonable to have bright-colored hair and not be a histrionic person, or you could be overweight and not be histrionic. These kinds of things. These are characteristic of it, but not diagnostic. This is just one check off the list. If you have one of these things in addition to the other criteria, then that's something. But just having this thing on its own isn't going to be diagnostic in and of itself. Paying particular attention or consistently using physical appearance to draw attention to self. Now, as a cosplayer, that one rings a bell for me, because it's a thing that I do from time to time. Is I go out in public wearing very attention-grabbing outfits, showing too much skin, brightly colored, gold-plated armor, things like that. But there's a key word in that definition there, and that is consistently uses. As a cosplayer, as a hobbyist, it's something that I do from time to time. Every few months I'll go out in public dressed like that. I might post a few photos of myself on social media doing that kind of thing, but that's really that's a branding, marketing exercise, frankly. I'm not actually going out in public dressed like that on a daily basis, whereas the histrionic sufferer probably is. They're going to the gym dressed in a sexy way. They're going to the office dressed inappropriately. They're going out to the mall showing too much skin. This is a thing that histrionic people will do as a matter of course, whereas your cosplay hobbyist probably isn't doing it on a daily basis. Although it wouldn't surprise me if we have a slightly higher prevalence of histrionic personality disorder within the cosplay community than you might see in other subcultures like Magic the Gathering. In fact, that's my running hypothesis, is that there probably is. I'm not aware of anyone having done studies like that, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if that were the case. All right, next criterion. Has a style of speech that is excessively impressionistic and lacking in detail. In other words, the person who has histrionic personality disorder will often talk about a topic sounding as if they don't really know what they're talking about. They're not going to get into a lot of detail about what they're talking about. They're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of it. They're just sort of speaking at a surface level and emoting over it.
See, Tony Abbott talked this talk when he was Prime Minister about, I want the Australian people to decide. But he was never actually even going to go ahead with a public vote. It was always a delaying tactic with him, because he is a worthless, spineless, lying piece of shit. But then he got knocked off by his own party. And then Malcolm Turnbull, who had always been in favour of marriage equality, but is also a spineless, worthless piece of shit, went, I'm going to go ahead with this vote thing, rather than just have the Parliament do its fucking job and pass a fucking law.
So you'll have noticed in that clip, not only is he speaking in sort of a vague, impressionistic way about his topic, he's not getting into any details of it. He clearly doesn't understand it all that well, or at least he doesn't appear to understand it all that well. But he's also demonstrating that sort of fake superficial emotionality. He's allowed himself to become massively overweight so that he takes up more space on the screen. He's got these brightly colors, this animated background, all designed to hold your attention. And also just speaking loudly. Speaking loudly, of course, is another one. Is another trick that histrionic people will use to draw attention to themselves.
Now, if you would shut the fuck up for the 50th billionth time!
Alright, next one is shows self-dramatization, theatricality, and exaggerated expression of emotion. Let's think back to Angry Ozzy there. He was clearly demonstrating exaggerated expression of emotion. He may well have been upset about the thing he was talking about, but the way he was presenting it, you're encouraged to believe that he feels a lot more strongly about it than he actually appears to. Self-dramatizing means exaggerating your own experiences, doing the one-up thing. Oh, this thing happened to you. Well, that happened to me twice, or it happens to me every day. That can lead to making up stories. You might have encountered the person who tends to tell a lot of lies about themselves, about their very attractive model girlfriend, or about their sexual exploits with 3 guys at that party one time. Things that clearly couldn't have happened. This is something that's fairly characteristic of histrionic personality disorder. They're making up stories to try and impress the people around them.
Oh, watch what you say. Brian here is a cherry. A cherry?
She was in a plane. France.
Not cherry. When have you ever gotten laid? I've laid lots of times. Name one. She lives in Canada. Met her at Niagara Falls. You wouldn't know her. Ever laid anyone around here? Oh.
Then the next criterion is suggestible, for example, is easily influenced by others or circumstances. So what the histrionic person is doing from a practical point of view is that they're reading the room. They're evaluating the peer group context that they're in, and they're trying to fit in, but not fit in, if that makes sense. They're trying to align themselves with the values and beliefs of the crowd that they identify themselves with, but still stand out from them. So they'll dress inappropriately and make a lot of noise to try and get that attention of that group, but then they'll do it in a way that is consistent with that group's beliefs, values, and interests. So they'll show themselves as being much too into the thing that everybody else is into. So everybody else is into a thing, let's say Star Trek fandom. That everybody else is at a level 6, the histrionic person will sell themselves as being at a 9. If they happen to be in a group of Star Trek fans, they'll claim to be a much bigger fan than they actually are. And if the mood of the group shifts over time, let's say a new Star Trek movie comes out that everybody hates, then that person will then hate it the worst. Whether or not they actually feel that way is kind of beside the point. You'll never know, because the way they talk about it, they're reflecting the opinions and attitudes of their peer group, but in an exaggerated, overly dramatic way. And then the 8th criterion is considers relationships to be more intimate than they actually are. So this is a tricky one. So this is the person who you maybe went to get coffee with one time, and now they're considered, and now they think that you're destined to get married, or you were nice to them one time, and now they think you're dating. Like this is possibly one of the most damaging criteria in the histrionic personality disorder, and it's kind of scary and creepy when you encounter this kind of thing. This is the creepy stalker stereotype of the histrionic personality disorder. Somebody who you've had a casual interaction with on a couple of occasions now consider you to be their best friend. It can be hard to deal with. All right, so those are the 8 criteria. As I said, the DSM-5 requires you to meet at least 5 of them in order to qualify for the diagnosis of histrionic personality disorder. But I mentioned at the beginning that it has a lot in common with the other 2 that we've already covered, the borderline personality disorder and narcissistic. So let's just go through what the differences are. So firstly, with borderline personality disorder. As I mentioned, a lot of clinicians consider this to just be a variant of borderline, but it is still classified generally as being a separate diagnosis, so we'll treat it as separate. So things that borderline personality disorder that has that histrionic doesn't are things like self-harm. So borderline personality disorder sufferers tend to make rash choices, behave irresponsibly, they have a high risk tolerance for themselves, and they'll get themselves into trouble either by accident, by engaging in risky behavior, substance abuse, or even deliberate self-harm, things like cutting or suicide attempts, that kind of thing. You tend not to see that in histrionic personality disorder. Although there's a relatively high comorbidity rate between histrionic and various other diagnoses, including depression, it's not as prevalent in the histrionic personality disorder, so much so that it's not characteristic of histrionic personality disorder, whereas it is of borderline. Borderline sufferers have that intense rage. So I talked about the similarity in the wild mood swings from one to the next. Now, in the borderline sufferer, they're having those wild mood swings, but they tend to default to anger more often than any other emotional state. With the histrionic sufferer, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, they'll go to the place of anger from time to time. We saw angry Ozzy pretending to be outraged about whatever he was talking about there. But that's not their default mode necessarily. They're just switching wildly from one emotion to the next to try and get people to look at them. Whereas the borderline sufferer is experiencing that rage at a sort of a deep existential level, and they're defaulting to it often, more often than any other. And then there's the really extreme version of, or form, or manifestation of borderline personality disorder, which is the paranoid dissociation, where they kind of lose touch with their reality and their sense of self. That's not really a characteristic we see of histrionic personality disorder. But what about the similarities to narcissism? I mean, there are certainly some characteristics in common. For example, they're both interested in being the center of attention. Difference there is that the narcissist has that sense of grandiosity. They tend to think of themselves, or at least behave in such a way that will lead you to believe that they think that they're better than everybody else. The histrionic isn't necessarily the case. They're just as happy to be the class clown as they am to be the puppet master of the group. It's that kind of thing doesn't matter as much to the histrionic as it does to the narcissist, because the histrionic person, the histrionic is trying to fit into the group and to mirror the values of the group, whereas the narcissist is trying to manipulate the values of the group. Another characteristic thing is that the narcissist is known for responding poorly to criticism. They'll respond with rage, whereas that's not necessarily the case with the histrionic. You can probably criticize a histrionic person and they'll respond in the same way as anybody else. Nobody really likes to be criticized, but the histrionic will probably react in the same way anybody else does, whereas the narcissist will react very poorly and you'll regret it. I tend to think of histrionic personality disorder as being probably the least bad of the 4 cluster B personality disorders in terms of the impact that it has on the people around them. I mean, you've got the creepy stalker vibe, and that's not fun. But ultimately, how does that really hurt? I mean, it can be uncomfortable for a while, sure. You've got the histrionic who can be annoying. In fact, if I was to sum up histrionic personality disorder in one word, it would be annoying. And that leads to the histrionic person having kind of shallow arm's length relationships with people instead of really settling into a nice, settled, comfortable, intimate relationship with anyone, really. And that sucks for them. But it sucks for them more than it does for other people, because everyone else is so annoyed by them that they automatically keep them at arm's length. But there are some potential pitfalls when it comes to dealing with someone who has narcissistic personality disorder. I talked about the flirtatiousness and the inappropriate sexual behavior. Now, this can, if employed in the wrong context, which it often is, can lead to things like accusations of sexual harassment. And that can be a really bad thing. I mean, it can be sort of a career-ending situation if you're not careful about it. That's hard. I mean, how you deal with that is record everything. If you have a person in your life, in your office or something like that who you're pretty sure is probably a histrionic person, just install a hidden camera in your cubicle. So whenever you're alone with this person, you're recording the interaction, so that if it ever comes back on you, you're armed with the data to be able to prove that no, in that meeting, I was not the one who was behaving inappropriately. She was. I mean, it's not a guarantee. You're not necessarily going to be able to get yourself out of it with that, but that's all I can suggest for how to arm yourself. Try not to be alone with somebody like that. Try to make sure that there's always at least one witness. Don't be in an office with a closed door with a person like that. I remind you that the histrionic diagnosis shouldn't be regarded as a moral judgment. They're not necessarily a bad person, but they do have these proclivities towards dodgy behavior, which can get you in trouble if you're on the receiving end of that behavior at the wrong moment. And there's the other element that I talked about of telling stories, making things up, the one-upsmanship. Oh, you had this thing happen to you, well, this other thing that was even worse happened to me. That kind of behavior, that has also historically led to some pretty bad outcomes for people. Things like dads being accused and convicted of sexually abusing their kids when no abuse ever happened, because the kid wanted to tell stories about how her dad molested her to her friend in order to impress her. Sure. I mean, that's a really hard thing to deal with, and I don't have a clue how to avoid that kind of a situation. Just be mindful that the histrionic personality disorder, although it's probably harder for the sufferer than it is for the people around them, there are still some potentially bad behaviors that need to be remembered and watched out for. And you want to be on guard when you're around a person like this. You don't want to let your guard down too much, because it can come back and bite you. All right, that's enough about histrionic personality disorder. I've still got one more of these in the series, and that's going to be the antisocial personality disorder. That's the roughest one, so I've saved it till last. That'll be out in a few weeks' time. If you have any questions, or if you'd like me to go into anything in more detail, there are comments below. You can find me on Discord. You can find me on Twitter, probably on Facebook sometimes, and ask any question you like. I'm happy to help. All right, that's it for now. Swat out.